Today we're going to go over 101 facts about the production of A New Hope. I'm not going to waste any time, let's just dive in. George Lucas originally envisioned Star Wars taking place in the 33rd century of our own galaxy, but he decided it was better to have a more mythological setting and a completely made-up world so that he could do whatever he wanted without having to follow any real-world physics or rules. The blue text at the start of the film was also meant to be the Star Wars version of Once Upon a Time to inform audiences that they were about to enter a fairy tale style story. The opening crawl was based on the Flash Gordon serials from the 1930s and 40s, which began each of their episodes the same way. Lucas wanted Star Wars to feel like audiences were being thrown into the middle of a serial story like Flash Gordon, as if they had missed several episodes and would just have to do their best to follow along. He wanted Episode 4 to be included in the crawl, but studio executives felt that would be too confusing, so it was omitted. Until 1981, when the film was re-released ahead of The Empire Strikes Back. Episode 4 and the subtitle A New Hope were then included as part of the crawl. The first drafts of the crawl to Star Wars were loaded with information using strange terms like the Dianoga, Legions of Latau, the Ashla, and the Bogan. While they were removed from the final version, all of those names and concepts would appear in later Star Wars stories. Director Brian De Palma helped George Lucas write the final version of the crawl so it would be more accessible to audiences. The Blockade Runner's name is the Tantive 4. No, not the Tantive, the Tantive. People try to correct me every time I say it, but according to the Star Wars radio drama, Tantive is the right pronunciation. The Blockade Runner was originally going to be the Millennium Falcon, but a television series called Space 1999 debuted before production began and used a ship design that was too similar to be so heavily featured. So the team went back to the drawing board and came up with a design that Lucas called the Flying Hamburger, claiming it had a lot more personality. The model for the Blockade Runner was 6 feet long. Despite being much larger in-universe, the model for the Star Destroyer was about half the Blockade Runner's size, measuring in at only 3 feet. George Lucas originally considered hiring Orson Welles to play Darth Vader, going so far as to contact him about the role, but ultimately it was decided his voice would be too recognizable. George wanted someone with a powerful voice who wasn't as well known at the time, which led him to James Earl Jones. Jones completed his work recording Darth Vader's dialogue in only 2.5 hours. He was paid $7,500 for his time. R2-D2's name came to Lucas during post-production for his prior film, American Graffiti. Lucas said his sound editor asked him for R2-D2 or Real 2 Dialogue 2 from the rack, and George immediately liked it as a name. R2 and C-3PO were both originally going to be bureaucratic characters rather than droids in the original drafts of the film, but they were always inspired by two bickering characters from the Akira Kurosawa film The Hidden Fortress. Lucas settled on R2 and 3PO being droids because he wanted them to be at the bottom of the societal totem pole. The shots of R2 and 3PO's escape pod disengaging from the Tantive 4 and falling towards Tatooine were the two first effects shot completed for the film, and the only shots that had been completed by the end of principal photography. The desert planet in Star Wars was originally called Utapau in rough drafts of the script. Of course, that name would get a second chance at life as the planet where Obi-Wan duels General Grievous in Revenge of the Sith. The Jawas were originally going to be rat-like creatures described as grimy and filthy. A prototype was created, but George felt they were too theatrical, and so they settled on a simple black stocking with eye bulbs instead. There was originally music playing over the sequence that introduces the Jawas, but it was very playful and undercut the tension of the scene. You can hear the music in the 2-disc special edition re-release of the soundtrack. The Chief Jawa was played by Jack Purvis, a friend of Kenny Baker who himself played R2-D2, but most of the Jawas were played by local children. Because so much of the Tunisian shooting was done near the border of Algeria, and they were using military trucks for the production, the Algerian government grew concerned that the sandcrawler was some sort of secret weapon and had to come out and inspect it. The sand troopers in the desert were played by local Tunisian men, and they were paid $6.50 for their day of work. Although they are far more prominent in the special editions of the film, a dewback was created for the original version, but it didn't work properly, and that's why it was mostly seen in the background. The sale of the droids at the Lars Homestead was one of the first scenes shot for the film. The Lars Homestead was inspired by locations in Matmata, Tunisia, where people really do live in holes in the ground. The homestead was actually filmed in two completely separate locations, with the droid sale taking place on a flat in the middle of the desert and then the hole in the ground in Matmata. That wasn't a popular decision, having two shooting locations instead of one, but George loved the end result. Luke Skywalker mentions wanting to visit a place called Tashi Station with his friends. That location was filmed in a deleted scene, but more recently it appeared in the Book of Boba Fett with look-alike actors playing two of Luke's childhood friends, Fixer and Cammy. The red droid, now named R5-D4, caused a lot of problems on set. The droid's head was of course meant to explode, but it was constructed with all of its remote controls inside the head, so they couldn't have it both roll and explode. So they rushed to repaint another droid red, put the exploding head on the replacement, and simply used piano wire to drag it along the sand. The characters of Owen and Beru Lars were named as early as the rough draft for Star Wars, but at that point they were anthropologists and had no relation to the Skywalkers. In the garage, C-3PO appears to not know who Princess Leia was despite just being on her ship. George Lucas cleared that up shortly after the film came out, saying he did know who Leia was but was programmed not to mention having knowledge of her. The binary sunset scene was originally scored with some version of Luke's theme or the main Star Wars theme, but when George first heard Obi-Wan's theme, or what we now know as the Force theme, he requested that it be placed over the sunset instead. The shots of the Landspeeder traveling across Tatooine were added late during production back in America. They all had to be wide shots because Mark Hamill was in recovery after a car accident, so a double was used in his place. The hovering Landspeeder effect was achieved by placing a mirror underneath the vehicle to hide the wheels. It worked with varying degrees of success, and the effect was touched up for the special edition of the film. The elephant that played the Bantha was named Margie. She apparently loved playing in a nearby creek in Death Valley when she wasn't actively filming any scenes. Peter Diamond, the stuntman playing the Tusken Raider that attacks Luke, was unable to see inside his costume. The fear in Mark's eyes was said to be at least somewhat real as he rolled around in the sand, dodging violent blows. Along with Alec Guinness, George Lucas also considered the legendary Japanese actor Toshiro Mifune for the role of Obi-Wan Kenobi. Mifune starred in several Akira Kurosawa films, including The Hidden Fortress. Early drafts of Star Wars referred to the Force as the Force of Others. It was simplified for A New Hope, but that phrase would later be used by Chirrut Imwe in Rogue One. Obi-Wan was originally going to live in a cave of some kind instead of a hut. Some video games based on A New Hope still reference the original story beat for some reason. The scene in Obi-Wan's home was written to have Leia's message come first, then the discussion of the Force, then the proposal to travel to Alderaan. The final film has it edited into a better flow. The lightsabers were originally supposed to be in-camera effects using spinning wooden dowels coated with reflective material that would appear to be illuminated when photographed. The effect did not work as envisioned, but you can still see some evidence of the powered lightsaber hilts in some shots. The boots they provided Peter Cushing for Grand Moff Tarkin's costume were far too small, according to the actor. He told George Lucas they were killing him, and the director kindly agreed to shoot the actor from the waist up whenever possible so he could wear slippers instead. Mark Hamill initially performed Luke's reaction to the death of his aunt and uncle by falling to his knees and sobbing, but George Lucas preferred a far more neutral reaction so the audience could project their own feelings onto the character. The computer-generated models for the rodent-like scurriers that were added to Mos Eisley in the special edition were heavily modified versions of the computer-generated velociraptor models used in Jurassic Park. Likewise, the model for the Rontos added into the special edition were modified versions of the Brachiosaurus model created for the same film. The Cantina Scene was one of the very first ideas George Lucas had for Star Wars. Before he even had a story, he said he knew he wanted the cantina with all its weird creatures in the film, and he knew he wanted a space battle. He had good concepts, but he was in search of a story to place them in. The Cantina Scene is partially inspired by a saloon scene from the 1956 western The Searchers starring John Wayne. That film would inspire elements of Star Wars for decades to come. The Cantina Band was a last-minute addition to the scene. The band all looked identical simply because they had to quickly mass-produce some masks to use for the band. The concept of Chewbacca as Han Solo's co-pilot was inspired by George Lucas's dog, an Alaskan Malamute who would often sit in the passenger seat of his car while he or his wife drove around town. Most of Greedo's scenes with Han Solo were done during reshoots when it was decided to eliminate Jabba the Hutt's scene for the theatrical release of the film. Most of the plot points from Jabba's scene were added into Greedo's dialogue, and that's why the two scenes repeat so many similar ideas in the special edition. Greedo also originally spoke Basic or English in the original version of their scene before the reshoots. Greedo's mouth was able to move by simply placing a clothespin into the actress Maria de Aragon's teeth, who would then use it to move the prosthetic around to simulate talking. The language of Huttese is based on the real-world Quechuan language spoken by the indigenous people of the Andes Mountains in South America. In the original version of the Jabba scene, the Hutt was a human played by Declan Mulholland. The plan was always to replace the human character with an alien creature, but you can still see Mulholland's likeness used in a canon Star Wars story as a member of the Sontul Pride criminal syndicate in the War of the Bounty Hunters comics. The special edition version of the scene includes music that was originally written to be Jabba's theme in Return of the Jedi, but the music was ultimately dropped from the final cut. The two main reasons the Jabba sequence was removed was because ILM wouldn't have enough time to complete the stop-motion creature Lucas wanted, and because there are so many Greedo clones walking around in the background, which I have always thought was funny. Garandan, or Long Snoot's dialogue, was created by using a processed version of actor John Wayne's voice. Carrie Fisher has said that the main reason Princess Leia has a British accent for some line readings is because it was her first day of filming and she was nervous to be working alongside the legendary Peter Cushing. The accent has since been retconned into Leia making fun of Grand Moff Tarkin's posh way of speaking. In the original drafts for Star Wars, Alderaan was actually the name of an Imperial base that floated in the clouds. The name was shifted to Leia's homeworld, but Lucas liked the idea of a city in the clouds, and of course that concept was eventually revisited in The Empire Strikes Back. Obi-Wan's original reaction to the destruction of Alderaan was far more intense, seeing him fall unconscious and have convulsions. Obviously, the final result was significantly toned down, similar to the way Luke's reaction to the death of his aunt and uncle was restrained. 12 holochess pieces were created for the film, but only 10 made the final cut. The other 2 were eventually included in Solo: A Star Wars Story, but Chewbacca breaks the game, causing those 2 pieces to disappear. The voices for the holochess pieces were provided by sound designer Ben Burtt. In the 4th draft of the script, during Han's disparaging remarks about the Force, Obi-Wan was going to make a slight gesture which would cause Han's blaster pistol to go off in his holster, causing a small explosion at his feet, but the idea was cut. The line, "I have a bad feeling about this," has become iconic in Star Wars, but George originally had it in mind for Indiana Jones. He was working on Raiders of the Lost Ark at the same time as Star Wars, and he thought it would be a fun thing for Indy to say, but realized the character was often alone during desperate situations, so there would be no one to say that line to. So he shifted it to Star Wars instead, where he had plenty of characters around all the time. The space troopers seen outside the Death Star hangar are both played by designer Joe Johnston, who would go on to direct several films of his own, including The Rocketeer and Captain America: The First Avenger. The famous 1138 Star Wars Easter egg was Mark Hamill's idea. He loves in-jokes and recited the number as a reference to George Lucas's first film, THX 1138, instead of what was written in the script. George asked him not to do that again, but wound up using the take anyway, sparking a Star Wars tradition that continues to this day. Princess Leia's cell number, 2187, is also a reference to a 1963 short film that greatly influenced George Lucas as a filmmaker, which was titled 2187. Most of the comedic dialogue found in Star Wars, including Han's, quote, boring conversation, was written by 2 friends of George's, Willard and Gloria Hike. Willard went on to direct the infamous film Howard the Duck. According to Mark Hamill, he had to re-record his first scene with Leia because he introduced himself as Luke Starkiller, the original name of the character. However, the book The Making of Star Wars claims the name change to Skywalker was made before that scene was shot, so I'm not sure which version of events is true. Maybe the name was changed, but Mark forgot in his first take. The Dianoga was intended to be a much bigger creature effect in the film, and even though it was created, it became less and less practical to shoot, so it was eventually only seen as a tentacle and then the lone eye stalk that was added during post-production. Mark Hamill burst a blood vessel in his eye during the filming of the Dianoga attack. The injury prevented him from filming any close-ups for nearly a month, including many of the shots of Luke in his X-Wing during the Battle of Yavin. The Wilhelm Scream is another Star Wars tradition that got its start in A New Hope. Ben Burtt recalled the distinct scream from an old Western film and was able to get the sound effect from Warner Brothers. The scream is still used in Star Wars today, most recently in The Book of Boba Fett. The stormtrooper that falls and lets out the Wilhelm Scream is Peter Diamond, the same stuntman who played the Tusken Raider that attacked Luke. During production, the crew referred to Luke and Leia's swing across the Death Star chasm as the Lash LaRue scene, named for a Western star known for his abilities with a bullwhip. Obi-Wan was originally going to survive his duel with Darth Vader, but Lucas thought the heroes too easily escaped the Death Star. He considered Chewbacca and C-3PO as potential casualties, but decided Obi-Wan was the best choice since the character didn't have much to do for the rest of the film, and it would help illustrate the mysticism of the Force. Alec Guinness was initially displeased, but accepted the change after a dinner with Lucas, who convinced him it was best for the story. C-3PO falling into a bundle of wires and screaming about his fear of melting was originally shot for the opening battle on the Tantive 4, but it was moved to the Millennium Falcon's escape from the Death Star during the edit. In early drafts of Star Wars, the planet Yavin was going to be the homeworld of the Wookiee species. Wookiees were going to learn to fly starfighters so they could join in the attack on the Death Star. That concept was abandoned, but revisited somewhat with the Ewoks in Return of the Jedi. The character General Vanden Willard was named for Willard Huyck, who I mentioned earlier. The animated Death Star plans were created on a computer by Larry Cuba at a time when computer animation was still in its infancy. The effect cost $10,200 to produce. Two actors played the character Wedge Antilles in A New Hope, Colin Higgins and Dennis Lawson. Higgins was unfortunately fired from the production after struggling through his lines, and Lawson replaced him. But both actors were overdubbed by David Ankrum. Higgins' version of Wedge has since been retconned into a new character named Cole Tackbright in the book From a Certain Point of View. Biggs was a character name George Lucas had written down all the way back in 1973. He was Luke's brother in the second draft of the script. In those earlier drafts, Darklighter was the name given to a fallen Jedi Padawan who came to know the evil half of the Force. During production, the Rebel starfighters sought out and attacked the Death Star on their own. The idea that the Death Star would be preparing to destroy Yavin and the Rebel base was put in during post-production to add urgency to the scene. The pilot Jack Porkins was played by William Hootkins, who worked with George Lucas again as one of the government agents in Raiders of the Lost Ark. Burnell Tucker plays the Rebel communications officer Del Gorin in A New Hope. He also plays a completely different Rebel character in The Empire Strikes Back, Lieutenant Romus Navander. George Lucas has claimed that two ships flying through space shooting at each other was one of his original ideas that sparked the creation of Star Wars. He said most space battles up until that point were slow or stationary, but he wanted to see multiple ships racing around in space. Accomplishing some of those shots was no easy feat. A medium difficulty shot was estimated to take up to 2.5 weeks to complete. The first Imperial pilot to be seen shooting down a Rebel ship has since been identified as Iden Versio, a founding member of Inferno Squad as seen in the book Battlefront 2 Inferno Squad by Christy Golden. Although it didn't appear until The Empire Strikes Back, the TIE bomber was developed for A New Hope as a TIE boarding craft. Its bent wing shape was repurposed into Darth Vader's TIE fighter when it was decided he should have a unique ship. The Death Star was listed as being 92 miles in diameter in production notes, which also listed the equatorial trench to be 2 miles wide. Many fans wrongly assume that the Rebels' trench run attacks take place in that equatorial trench, but it's actually one of 18 trenches that start about halfway up from the equator and head towards the pole. The trench was designed to be about 40 miles long in total. The model for the trench measured in at about 60 feet in length. Industrial Light and Magic knew that the Death Star's trench was built to be about 300 yards wide when scaled up, so realistically, the walls would not appear to go by very fast even when compared to ships speeding towards the thermal exhaust port. They argued that the faster the walls go by, the smaller the scale, and apparently George had that argument with his effects crew a lot. George didn't care about being accurate to the models or real-world physics, he wanted the feeling of speed over realism. In the shooting script, Luke actually went on 2 trench runs, one where he used the targeting computer and one where he used the Force, but the story was condensed into only one attack. Star Wars was almost rated G, but the studio, Fox, requested the PG rating instead. They did feel that some scenes and noises could be scary for young children, but they also feared teenagers would choose not to see the movie because the G rating was considered uncool. The ratings board members were shocked because no film had ever asked for a more strict rating before. It was George's idea to release the movie over Memorial Day weekend, which wasn't normal for movies back then. The 2 biggest weekends for movies were Christmas and the 4th of July. Nobody opened on Memorial Day because kids weren't out of school yet, but George chose that weekend for that exact reason, because he wanted kids to see the movie and then talk about it at school. George said people thought he was out of his mind, but his strategy paid off. And there you have it, 101 facts about A New Hope. I would love to hear if you learned anything new down in the comments. Check out some of my other 101 facts videos about Star Wars at this playlist. If you haven't already, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, follow us on Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram, and consider checking out our Patreon page for even more Star Wars content. As always, thanks for watching, and may the Force be with you.